Last time we took a look at the Islamic Empire or empires, a historical overview from really the advent of Islam all the way to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And today we're going to go back and we're sticking with the Islamic culture, but we're going to be turning towards more of a religious topic. We're going to be looking at what are known as the 5 pillars of Islam, which are really foundational activities that kind of define the life of a Muslim. So let's go ahead and take a look at these famous 5 pillars. You may be familiar with them. They are fairly well known, especially if you've taken classes in world religions or even history. I mean, basic high school history classes often cover things like the 5 pillars. Now, first let's talk about what's called the Dar al-Islam. The Dar al-Islam means the house of Islam. This is a metaphor. Basically the idea that the entire Muslim world is part of one body, one home. So that architectural metaphor is actually pretty useful. You can think of the Quran, right, as the which are the inspired words of Allah, right, the eternal word of Allah, as a foundation for the house. Okay, and then the house itself is held up by 5 pillars. So this whole idea of the 5 pillars is also an architectural metaphor. Right, these are the things that support the structure. Okay, now the Ummah, that's the community. We've talked about that before. The Islamic community is known as the Ummah, and it offers an invitation for everyone to enter the house. There's this idea that no matter what branch of Islam you are, and we really haven't talked very much except in the historical overview about the different sects within Islam in a general sense, right? Sunni versus Shia. It's a little bit more complicated than that because you have sects and subsects all over the Islamic world throughout the historical development of Islam. But you still want to think of the Islamic community as one body, okay, part of one great house. So let's take a look at the 5 pillars. These are the unifying principles. Right, the 5 pillars unite all Muslims. In fact, all Muslims who are regarded as true Muslims generally agree to these 5 pillars. Now, there's some exceptions, like I said. They're common among the Sunni and among most Shia, though you do have some sects like the Ismaili and the Druze that have additional pillars added. As a matter of fact, we don't even want to get into the discussion of the Druze because it gets a little bit more complicated, how other Muslims view the Druze. But the 5 pillars are going to be these 5. You have the Shahada, Salat, Zakat, Saum, and Hajj. And you probably know some of these pillars, but not necessarily by the Arabic terms. So let's take a look at each of them in turn and walk through kind of why they're important and what they are specifically, starting with the Shahada. Okay, Shahada is the testimony. It really means open testimony. It's a confession of faith. This is the doorway to the house. Again, if we're going to stick with that metaphor of the Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and the pillars supporting it, you can think of the Shahada as the entranceway. Right? If you enter the house, it has to come by way of Shahada because the confession is how one becomes a Muslim. Okay, the statement itself is known as the kalima. Okay, that's the name of the statement. Most people just refer to it as the Shahada. Now, the Sunni Shahada is shorter than the Shia Shahada. Okay, in Arabic, and I apologize for my pronunciation, but in Arabic, the Sunni Shahada is Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadun Rasulullah, which means I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. Okay, the Shia Shahada adds an additional line, basically the third confession, which says, I testify that Ali is the vice-regent of God. Okay, so it has that particular place for Ali, and if you remember our historical overview, it was during the time of Ali that you start to have the division in Islam between Sunni and Shia. He was the last, remember, of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. Okay, now the statement itself is not actually, and there's a statement, I should have brought that up a second ago. Matter of fact, in the graphic on the screen, you could see, I believe it's Kufic script, the Shahada. They have a huge artistic tradition that relates to calligraphy. So it's the Shahada written, it kind of mirrored left and right. Okay, so the Shahada is written twice, one backwards, one forwards, making this wonderful, I guess, harmonious or balanced illustration in the form of a building, right, in the form of a mosque, which is kind of attractive. Okay, you wouldn't recognize that as writing It looks, very geometrical and stuff like that, but again, it is actually text. Okay, then now I was going to say that the Shahada itself is not found in the Quran, but it is found as far as the concepts behind the Shahada are in the Quran. Okay, it's kind of like when Christians talk about the doctrine of the Trinity not being in the Bible, where the people that hold to the doctrine of the Trinity will actually say, well, it might not say anything about the Trinity, but the component parts of the concept are there in the Bible. Okay, same thing with this in the Quran. You have lots of things that are included in the 5 pillars that might not be found directly within the Quran, but there is some tradition or some elements of it that can be found within the Quran. Okay, so anyways, move on to the second one, which is Salat. Salat is going to be your daily ritual prayer. Within Islam, there's actually 2 kinds of prayer. You have what's called dua, which is personal, spontaneous prayer, and then you have salat or salah. That's obligatory, it's communal, it's ritual, it's prescribed. This is the stuff that you have to do as a good Muslim. This would be a daily activity, and as a matter of fact, it's going to be multiple times during the day. Now, it's complex in that there are different component parts of salat. So first thing you have is the adhan, or call to prayer. This would be issued by a muezzin. That's the person who goes to the top of the minaret, and the minaret would be one of those towers around the mosque. In the background photo, you could actually see a mosque, and you see the towers on the ends. Those are the minarets. Okay, so the muezzin goes up to the top of the minaret, and he begins the adhan, the call to prayer, and he begins always with what's called the takbir, which is a phrase you may have heard before, Allahu Akbar, which means Allah is literally greater. It's usually just translated as Allah is great or God is great. Okay, that's the beginning of the call, and it would go on to say something like, come to prayer, come to peace, all the blessings and stuff like that. But again, this would be a call so that everybody knows it's time to pray. Okay, so that begins every adhan. The next thing is before prayer begins, you go through what's known as wudu. Wudu is the ablution. Okay, this is actually found in Surah 5 about washing yourself. It gives you the prescriptions of how you're supposed to wash yourself. And it's not necessarily about actual physical cleansing, but it's, again, ritual cleansing. But it did involve water when you had it. And you would wash, hands up to the elbows. You'd wash your face and head. You wash your feet up to the ankles. And since, early Arabia was a desert territory, as a matter of fact, I shouldn't say just early Arabia, but Arabia in general is a desert territory. You're not always, especially if you're on caravan or something like that, you're not always close to a water source where you could do it with water. So in Surah 5, it actually indicates how you can also do it with earth, clean earth or sand. Okay, sometimes people will even do this using their own breath to go through at least the motions of washing and purification. Because like I said, it's ritual more than anything else. Okay. The next thing is you need to find the proper direction. This is called the qibla. Now, if you're in a mosque, this is easy because the mosque will usually have what's called the mihrab, which is the niche, okay, that indicates the direction of prayer. So everybody faces the mihrab or the same direction. Okay. When you're elsewhere, there are different methods you could probably use. But the idea of praying in a particular direction, that also is found in the Quran. Okay. In Surah 2, it talks about facing towards the sacred mosque, okay, which is the Kaaba. Okay, the indication would be Mecca. And we talked historically that the time of Muhammad, he prayed originally to Jerusalem, and he changes the Qibla at a certain point to Mecca. But today, everybody faces the same direction, which would be Mecca. Okay, now once everybody's facing the right direction, you move on to what are known as the actual prayer, which would involve not just praying, but the movements that go along with it, which are known as the rakat, plural. Okay, and there's basically 7 different positions. You can find different charts that will instruct people on how to do this properly, and sometimes there's more. It involves, standing and crossing the arms, bowing, prostrating, kneeling, in different cycles. Okay, depending on how many times you go through the prayer as you go through it. So there's this very formalized thing, and the whole community does this together. Again, in the photo that you're seeing is all the people, again, in the kneeling position, all together going through prayer. Okay. Obviously, the mosque behind them is not the one in Mecca because they would be facing in the wrong direction. But then how often do you pray is another big thing. It's actually a 5 times daily prayer that's prescribed. Now, it's prescribed in the hadith. We find this in Bukhari's hadith, the whole story about why only 5 times. I forget how many originally it was. Muhammad on his night journey is taken up to heaven where Allah tells him about prayer. And I think it's something like, I'm going to I apologize if I get the number wrong, something like maybe 100 times a day you're supposed to pray. And he goes down through the various heavens to meet with Moses before he descends, and I believe Moses sends him back up to negotiate fewer prayers over the course of the day, and eventually they get the number down to 5. So Bukhari kind of tells us this story. The Quran itself doesn't mention 5 prayers. The Quran mentions 3 prayers a day. Okay, but the tradition has become, thanks to the practice of Muhammad, to do it 5 times daily. Anyways, the 5 prayers are these: the Fajr, which is the dawn prayer, the Duhur, which is midday prayer, the Asr, late afternoon, Maghrib, evening prayer, and Isha, which is the night prayer. Now, in the time before we have, GPS devices and cell phones and accurate clocks and things like that, they would know dawn prayer by looking at a thread. The muezzin would wait and would hold up 2 threads, a black thread and a white thread. And as soon as he was able to distinguish the two, because when it's dark, you cannot distinguish the black thread from the white thread, but as soon as the sun starts to rise, the moment you could see that there was a difference between the two, that was when the call to prayer would go out. Okay, so that's how they would tell it's dawn prayer, it's time. Okay. Also, with each prayer during the day, there are different cycles of repetition. So for instance, at dawn prayer, and again, this would be different. I'm kind of speaking in a broad sense, but different sects within Islam probably have different little ways of doing it. So you could probably encounter different Muslims that will say, no, we do it different here, we do it different in my mosque. That's not that uncommon. But at dawn prayer, it would be common to do 2 rakats out loud when you're going through the prayer. So that's 2 cycles of the motions out loud as you pray. At midday, they would do 4 rakats, 4 cycles, but you would do them silently. Okay, they would do these to themselves. Late afternoon, 4 rakat silent. In the evening, 3. They would do 2 out loud and 1 silent. And at nighttime, they do 4 rakats again, and they would do 2 out loud and 2 silently. Okay, and then of course the last evening prayer would be issued again using the thread method to tell when it was becoming nighttime. Okay, so very, very prescribed, very, very rigorously defined. And again, everybody follows the same pattern because it's this whole idea of everybody being one body, one ummah before Allah when you come to pray. Okay, so that was very, very important, this idea of community. It's done even in prayer. Now, the next is zakat. Zakat is a charity. Basically, it's conceived of like a tax, but it's basically an Islamic duty towards the community, right? To care for the poor, to care for the needy, to also support Islamic missions, right? The spreading of the religion. And that would also include military activity, again, in the early years, which is often referred to as the jihad or the lesser jihad. If we haven't talked much about jihad, but there are a couple of different types of jihad that are mentioned within Islam. The greater jihad, which is, and by the way, jihad means struggle. So there's the greater jihad, which is usually conceived of as an internal struggle for purity and to live their life according to the way Allah wants you to live. And then the lesser jihad is very often described as kind of fighting for the sake of the faith against those that persecute. Okay. Now, the tax rate is always a question. How much needs to be paid? And it typically depends on the Sharia, okay, which is, again, the law code. We haven't really talked about Sharia yet, but we're going to do that probably in our next lecture. And it would usually be around 2.5% of somebody's income, okay? And again, it might be calculated differently depending on where you go, and how it's collected will also be different depending on what country you're in and what government you're under. So some governments, even today, will use a government department to collect the zakat. Some will use self-declaration. Sometimes the mosque will have boxes inside, like the picture that just showed up above, which is a collection box inside a mosque for people to donate, okay? And that money would go directly to the mosque for its activity. Now, as far as non-Muslims living in Muslim countries, historically they don't pay the zakat. This is only a duty for Muslims. So they would pay a different type of tax, and we've already talked about this. Historically, it's been known as the jizya, which is a protection tax, right, for non-Muslims under Islamic rule. This qualifies them for that position of dhimmitud, or protected status. Now, the amount that the non-Muslim pay is actually greater than the zakat, usually about twice the zakat, let's say around 6% instead of the 2.53%. Okay? But those are the differences. But that is a duty, and it's a very important part of Islam to take care of the poor within the community. Again, if you consider the community as one body, you don't want to leave any members of that body uncared for. So it's a very important thing in Islam. The fourth pillar is going to be known as Saum. And this is a complete fast during the holy month, which you've probably heard of as the holy month of Ramadan. Now, this month was already sacred, remember, prior to the time of Islam. This was the month of truce during the pre-Islamic period that we talked about. And it's the time Muhammad would go apart to the cave at Hira and meditate. And it's where he, in this month, had his first revelation of Jibril and his first revelation of the Quran. Now, as a complete fast, there is no food, there is no drink. Some people go even so far as to not even swallow their own saliva. Some people in the Middle East will actually put like a scarf through their mouth so that they can absorb the saliva so they don't accidentally do something that would be forbidden during the day. There's also no sex, okay? Now, the exceptions for the fast, there were. In Islam, there's exceptions for people that are sick or elderly or pregnant or even small children. But if you were healthy and not kind of at an at-risk category, then you would be expected to abide by this. But it's not a complete fast the entire month without breaks. That would be pretty extreme, as you would imagine. So here's kind of the legislative requirements. Number one, it's the entire 9th month, but it alternates fast, feast, because it works from sunrise to sunset. The fast is from sunup to sundown, basically in line with the call to morning prayer up to the time of the call to evening prayer. Okay? Again, once you can tell the white thread from the black thread. After evening prayer, after dark, nighttime, the prohibitions are actually lifted, okay? And people will engage in feasts and not necessarily celebration yet. That will come at the end of the month, but at least feasting. So they would be able to eat. They would be able to drink. Now, originally, sex was actually prohibited even at nighttime, but that changed even during the time of Muhammad. Okay, there's actually some indication that those kind of prescriptions were lifted very, very early on. So even after dark, all of those things are allowable again. Now, at the end of the fast, at the end of the month of Ramadan, there is a very important holiday in Islam. It's known as the Eid al-Fitr. The Eid al-Fitr is the celebration of the end of Ramadan, the celebration of the end of the fast, and it's on the first day of the next month, which is Shawwal. Okay, and it lasts for about 3 days on average, 1 to 3 days. Okay, and that would be a great time of feasting, as you would imagine, especially after going a whole month with these long intermittent fasting. I guess that's the idea of intermittent fasting, if you've heard of that nowadays. The Muslims have been doing that literally for centuries. Okay, it's becoming now popular just for health reasons in the West, but it's been there all along. And as a matter of fact, there are lots of religious traditions that have fasting traditions, even in Judaism and Christianity. So a little bit different, of course, than the way that was practiced in Islam. All right, the fifth and final pillar is the one that we're going to talk about a little bit at more length. It's a little bit longer because it's a little bit more complicated. This is known as the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage. Okay, now when you're talking about the other pillars, the Shahada, you have to do that when you become a Muslim. This is what makes you a Muslim. And it's not just something you do once in your life, the Shahada. You would repeat this many times. This would be a common statement. You hear this when you're born. You hear this when you die. Those are the types of things. It's core to who you are as a Muslim. The Salat, the prayer, that's a daily thing, 5 times every day. Zakat is something that you pay at least annually. The fast at Ramadan once a year, okay? But when it comes to the Hajj, this is an obligation that would be required one time in your life, okay? So it's not the type of thing you have to do. Now, you could do it more than once, but it would be something that would be required at least once, if at all possible. And for the whole history of Islam, there were probably many people in various places of the world that just didn't have the ability to get to Mecca on pilgrimage, okay? But today it's a lot easier, obviously, with modern transportation and stuff like that. So let's talk a little bit about the Hajj, the pilgrimage, to the Kaaba, the Axis Mundi. This is the center of the world from the Islamic perspective. Now, it's during the 12th month of the year that the official Hajj takes place, which is the month of Dhul Hijjah, basically from the 8th to the 12th of the month. And it's a reenactment of the pilgrimage, actually 2 pilgrimages, the pilgrimage that Abraham took with Ishmael. Okay, they're the ones that originally built the Kaaba according to tradition, and the pilgrimage that Muhammad took when he went back to Mecca. Okay, now There are, we could say, also a greater or a lesser Hajj. We're going to be mainly focusing on the greater Hajj. So the greater Hajj is the mandatory one that I'm talking about, right? Done in the specific month of Dhul Hijjah. There are other types of Hajjs, which might not even be appropriate to call it Hajj specifically, but we think of Hajj as a pilgrimage. But there are other types of pilgrimages, which might be called the lesser Hajj. This is called the Umrah. The Umrah is the type of pilgrimage to Mecca that you could do at any time of the year, as many times as you want. It involves fewer rituals, much shorter. It would involve what's known as tawaf and sa'i. I'll talk about those in just a little bit, but it's absolutely non-compulsory. You don't have to do it at all, but like I said, you're permitted to do it whenever. Okay. Now, many people will do this at the beginning or end of Ramadan. This just becomes a kind of a tradition. But it's the greater Hajj that is the one that's mandatory and, very specific as to when and how you do it. So let's take a look at the greater Hajj, starting with the first day, which is the 8th day of Dhul Hijjah. All right, this is when the Haji, the person on pilgrimage, will go to Mecca. And, of course, the destination is the Kaaba. And before they can approach the Kaaba, before they can go to the great mosque, okay, Masjid al-Harram, you have to actually go through what's called Haram, or consecration. First, you enter what's known as a state of Ihram, which is a ritually purified state. Okay, you perform what's known as wudu. Then you perform all of this at a place known as Mikat, which is kind of the entry point before you get to the mosque. Okay, so it's some ways away. I forget how far it is from the actual mosque, but this is done away from the holy sanctuary. Okay, after that, once you're purified, there are lots of things you can't do. You can't have any kind of sexual relations for the rest of the pilgrimage. You can't cut your hair. You can't cut your nails. As far as how the men dress, in the picture up above, you could see which is a dress known as Ihram. Ihram is not only the state of purification, but the clothing is also referred to as Ihram. And it's a basically very, very simple two-piece white garment. Your head has to remain uncovered. And it's this idea that everybody dressing the same will be equal before God. Okay. Now, the Haji must also then express intention to participate in the pilgrimage by reciting a particular little recitation, right? Here I am, O God, in response to your call. Here I am, here I am. You have no partner. Here I am. All praise, grace, and sovereignty belong to you. You have no partner. Okay, so once that is expressed, you are now committed to the pilgrimage. And the first major activity in the pilgrimage is what's called the tawaf. The tawaf is known as a circumambulation, okay, which is the circling around the Kaaba itself within the mosque. And you can see in the little graphic people going in the counterclockwise direction around the black box. That's the mosque, the Kaaba itself, draped in a black curtain for the most part. Okay, it's a stone building underneath. Okay, so you do this 7 times. You circle counterclockwise, and at the time of the pilgrimage, you're talking about millions of people. You can imagine how very difficult it is to get anywhere near this thing, which is why in the very background of that illustration, you can see people on the upper and lower decks way beyond. Now, remember, this mosque, the Masjid al-Harram, is one of the largest buildings in the entire world, okay, specifically to accommodate people for such an activity. Okay, so that's the tawaf. The thing that follows after that is known as the sa'i, which is the hastening. And the hastening is also done 10 times within the masjid between 2 mountains that have been enclosed within, the mountains of Safa and Marwa. Okay, and this is a reenactment again of an event in Islamic tradition, which is the event where Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, searches for water for her child Ishmael while they were in the desert. Now, you can see in the photo right there, the lanes that they have. These weren't always present. Obviously, this is kind of a new building, but you've got one direction for coming in, towards Safa, and one direction going from Safa. And in the center, which is the photo that I've got there, you've got people that are older or handicapped or can't move as rapidly as the others, because when this gets going, this was actually, you're supposed to hasten. You're supposed to move quickly. And unfortunately, people have been hurt. Or routinely hurt. If they fall down in the midst of this kind of hastening, people can be crushed, and people have died doing this. But again, here's a visual of and I forget which hill this is. I think it's Safa. I could be wrong, but again, the enclosed rock within the masjid. Okay, so you can see this is one of the endpoints on that courseway. Now, after you do the hastening, then you would drink from the Zamzam well. This is where Hagar eventually got the water that she needed from the angel that visited her. After the activities at the mosque, people then go out to the place known as Mina, about 5 miles east, and they would spend the rest of the time in prayer, contemplation from really noon on, and then essentially until the next morning. Okay, they would basically camp at Mina. Okay, so that's day 1. Day 2 and 3 I'll put together on this slide. Day 9, or the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, was spent at the plains of Arafat. Actually, you could see the entire route of the pilgrimage from Mikat, where you check in, to Mecca, and then on to Mina, and then on to the plains of Arafat at the very end. The plains of Arafat, this is where Muhammad gave his final sermon, his farewell sermon. It's called the Mount of Mercy, the hill there. And this was a few months prior to, remember, when he died in 632. So they basically stand facing Mecca for a day of prayer. And this is supposed to be the best prayer in all of Islam, to pray at the plains of Arafat. And then they would listen to sermons. After that, they make their way to Muzdalifah, which is an open area where they can socialize, more prayer. And then they would generally spend the night, again, camping at Muzdalifah. And then on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah, they would return towards Mina. And at Mina, they would reenact what's known as the stoning of the Jamrat. Okay, the Jamrat are these 3 pillars that are set up there representing the 3 temptations that the devil presented to Ishmael. Okay, and Ishmael kind of drives the devil off by throwing stones at him. So they reenact this by throwing stones, 7 stones, at these pillars, and they recite the takbir. Okay, so that's an activity on the 10th. The next day, I think it's the next day, is the Eid al-Adha, which is the next major holiday. Might be the same day, to tell you the truth. I'm forgetting the exact date. But this, the Eid al-Adha is the second major holiday in Islam next to Eid al-Fitr. Okay, this is celebrated not only for people on Hajj, but for people all over the Islamic world. And this is supposed to commemorate the sacrifice of Ishmael, or when Abraham went to sacrifice Ishmael. They didn't actually sacrifice Ishmael, because much like the story we find in the Old Testament of Isaac, Abraham and Isaac, God replaces Ishmael or Isaac with a substitute, a ram that takes his place. Okay, but that's the activity that's being commemorated, and people would then repeat the tawaf, the circumambulation. They would repeat the hastening, the sa'i, and then they exit Ihram. They exit this state of ritual purification, and when men leave this state, they actually have to have their heads shaved. Okay, and after that, they would then return to Mina, some of them, for the night. Now, that ultimately concludes the main Hajj. There are also optional days for people that can afford optional days. This is not something required, but people would often stay longer. If you make your way all the way out to Mecca, you might as well see other holy sites. So on the next several days, basically the 11th, 12th, and 13th of Dhul Hijjah, they would often go back out to Mina, throw some more stones at the pillars. On the final day, they might repeat the tawaf, and then after that, you would be able to add to your name the title al-Haji. Okay, that would be something that you could complete. It just basically tells people that you have completed the Hajj. And if you're a woman, it wouldn't be al-Haji, it would be al-Hajjah. Okay, so there's a difference between the masculine and feminine version of it, but it basically says, I am a person that has completed the Hajj. And they would often issue certificates. This particular certificate is a certificate of Hajj that was issued back in 1205. Okay, so they've been doing this for a long, long time to actually show that you have officially completed that requirement of the faith. Now, other options are also there as well. Like I said, not only have you seen Mecca, but some people that can afford it will often go up to Medina. Okay, in Medina, there's a number of holy sites. Obviously, the Masjid al-Nabawi, which is the Prophet's Mosque, the Quba Mosque, which is a mosque that Muhammad built himself, and then the Masjid al-Qiblatain, the Mosque of the 2 Qiblas. Okay, those are really important holy sites right there. And of course, the Prophet's Mosque has the tomb of Muhammad. Okay, remember, he was laid to rest in Medina, not in Mecca. And then you also visit the graves of those that fell at the Battle of Uhud, and a number of other things. And if you wanted to go even further, some people will even go all the way up to Jerusalem and visit the Dome of the Rock. Okay, remember, those are the 3 holiest cities. Mecca first, Medina second, and Jerusalem would be third. So those, in a nutshell, are the 5 pillars of Islam. in a rough format. Like I said, there are different ideas on how these things would be practiced depending on if you're Sunni, if you're Shia. Clearly, the Shahada is going to be different between the two groups. And then you've got subsects of either of these that might have little variations. But in general, this is the picture that's presented, and I think it's a pretty good picture. Next time, we are going to actually turn our attention towards the difference between the Sunni and the Shia and talk about some of the other sects involved as well, even maybe if we have time to discuss a little bit about Sufism.